Good morning, ladies. Our story today is found in Matthew 15, verses 29 to 38, and it's called A Kingdom for All, the feeding of the 4,000. I was 13 and man enough to be off on an adventure with my friends, yet still boy enough for my mother to pack a lunch for me for my journey. Be careful, my son, she said, as she placed a tie cloth in her hands. I could feel the brittle outline of a couple of dried sardines and the warmth of fresh bread. "Hurry, Elias!" Marcus shouted to me from the street. "They say he was healing people on the mountainside. Crowds are coming from everywhere." "I'm coming," I called to him before turning to my mother. "I will be careful, Mother. See you in a couple of days." Then I was out the door to join my friends. We bolted down the street past the merchants with their carts and the homes of our neighbors. We were headed for the Decumanus Maximus, the main street of Hippos, that stretched straight through the center of the city from the east gate to the west. The street was bordered by hundreds of huge columns, each 15 feet tall. All other streets in Hippos ran out from this main thoroughfare at right angles. The Decumanus Maximus was in sight when we almost ran full tilt into a large hairy man as he exited a bathhouse. He growled at us and we mumbled an apology. As he turned to leave, Luke motioned for us to look inside the door of the bathhouse that he had left ajar. "Look at that," he said, awestruck. There on the wall of the entrance hall was a huge relief of Hercules. He towered larger than life and in full color, with a cape made of lion's skin draped over his muscular back and a club in his hand. His hair and beard were long and wild, and his face was filled with fury. "Come on, let's go," Marcus said, and we were off again. We took a left on the main street and darted past temples and fountains and underneath shaded colonnades. Our leather sandals pounded on the stones beneath our feet. We ran past the statue of the emperor, the guard tower, and through the western gate. At last we began to make our journey along the steep path that snaked down the side of the mountain as the sea glistened in the sunlight in front of us. Marcus reached out a hand to stop us for a moment. We all caught sight of the crowds of people making their way from all directions to a small group of men on the mountainside. It was the healer. Months before, the same mighty man of God had come across the sea and cast devils from the wild man who lived in the tombs. A man so violent that the strongest men in Decapolis had attempted to bind him with chains to no avail. And afterward, this man, who had terrified the entire region, went city to city, bearing witness of the man of God, had freedom by simply speaking the words. Now the healer had returned, and people from all over Decapolis were bringing their sick and disabled to him in the hope that he might heal them. We made our way down the winding path past the magnificent mausoleums in the city's elite, resplendent columns, homes for the dead. On the foot of the mountain below, once on level ground, we pushed our way through the crowd to climb a tree near the center of the action. We had the perfect front row seats. The healer and his friends stood below us and a few feet to the left. Spread out before us in a great mass of humanity were the blind, deaf, and lame. I watched breathlessly as an aged woman led her deaf and mute son to the healer. He reached out and put his fingers in the young man's ears. The healer closed his eyes and sighed before placing his finger on the man's mouth. Suddenly, the young man's eyes grew wide as he turned toward his mother's voice. Then he laughed aloud and he startled by the sound of his own voice. Jesus smiled in response to their thanks and then turned to the long line of suffering before him. We watched him heal throughout the day. The blind left his presence seeing. The lame walked. The crooked limbs were made straight at the touch of his hand. As the sun set that evening, we ate from the provisions we had brought with us and settled down with the crowd to sleep underneath the stars for the night. Camp began to stir the next morning with the first rays of sunlight as sleepy travelers rummaged through their belongings for their breakfast. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. I untied my cloth to retrieve the last piece of my bread before shaking the crumbs onto the ground below. Soon the healer resumed his place. The line formed before him, and he began to work once again. My friends and I climbed the tree to watch. All that day and the next, people came. He touched each one, met each needs. Often our empty stomachs reminded us that we should start for home, but we just could not bear to leave the wonder of the next miracle. Finally, at the end of the third day, the healer looked about and found there was no one left to heal. He surveyed the crowd before him for a moment and then turned to his friends. I have compassion on these people. They are already been with me for 3 days, and they've had nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His friends turned to look at the crowd of more than 4,000 before them, and then back to Jesus. Where would we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Well, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. They took a moment to confer with one another about the matter and then turned back to him. 7, they replied, and just a few small fishes. Jesus told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and then he took the 7 loaves of bread and a few dried sardines in his hands and thanked God for them before breaking off pieces and handing them to his disciples to pass out to the people. When the man came to us in the tree, we took the bread and gratefully ate our fill. 7 small loaves, a few sardines, yet somehow the pieces just kept coming until everyone was satisfied. Jesus called for his friends to find the baskets and pass around to collect the leftovers. Once they were finished, there were 7 baskets full in all. Far more food than what they had in the beginning. As the disciples brought the food to show Jesus, he explained to them that just as he has provided miraculously for 5,000 Jewish pilgrims on the way to the Passover not long before, he had not provided for us, the Gentiles of Decapolis. He wanted them to know the kingdom of God wasn't just for the Jews, but that he had come for all. I saw the man who had once lived in the tombs, violent and filled with demons, sitting nearby. Now he was peaceful and whole. And I thought of mighty Hercules, slayer of the lions, terrible in his wrath. Hercules either had not been willing or unable to help that man. I looked down at the baskets filled with bread, and then at the crowd as they quietly made their way home, the blind seeing, the lame walking, the deaf hearing. None of my gods had ever done anything so great. I dropped from the branch of the tree and hit the ground and ran straight for Hippos. "What's the rush?" Marcus yelled after me. "I have to go and tell my family," I shouted back over my shoulders. The kingdom of God had come for all. Healer, you came for me when I was too helpless and blind to know how I needed you. You gave me eyes to see and ears to hear, and you set me free and restored my soul. Thank you for extending the kingdom of God to me. In you I live and move and have my being. Let me never take for granted such amazing grace offered to me, one who was so far away. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.